Off the southwestern coast of the Korean peninsula lies a beautiful island, a tourist paradise known as Jeju. With its stunning landscapes and unique culture, it's often called the Hawaii of the East, drawing visitors from all across the country. Far to the northwest, in Gyeonggi Province, is Incheon, South Korea's third-largest city. It's a major port, a bustling hub of maritime trade just 40 kilometers west of Seoul. And in the city of Ansan, not far from Incheon, stands Danwon High School. In the spring of 2014, 325 sophomore students from Danwon High were buzzing with excitement. They were about to embark on a 4-day school trip, a rite of passage, sailing from Incheon port to the beautiful island of Jeju. At the time, a large ferry was docked in Incheon. It had previously sailed for 18 years as the MV Namanoe for a Japanese company, with a perfect safety record. But it had since been purchased by South Korea's Chonghaejin Marine Company. The company's president, Yoo Byung-un, personally renamed it the MV Sewol, a name that means to transcend the world. He had big plans for the old ship. Under his direct supervision, the Sewol underwent a major overhaul. Extra cabins were added to the upper decks. The first and second decks were for cargo, the third and fourth for passengers, and the fifth held the bridge and crew quarters. Yoo, an amateur photographer, even had an art gallery installed at the bow to display his own work. When the modifications were done, the MV Sewol was the largest ferry of its kind in South Korea, capable of carrying 960 people and nearly 1,000 tons of cargo. For a year, it had been running the Incheon-Jeju route 3 times a week, an overnight journey that let passengers sleep on the ship and wake up ready to explore the island. That spring, the students of Danwon High boarded buses for Incheon port, their minds filled with dreams of ocean breezes and the sights of Jeju. None of them could have possibly imagined they were heading into one of the nation's greatest disasters. On the evening of Tuesday, April 15, 2014, the students arrived at the port, lining up with their luggage, ready to board their ferry, the MV Ohamina. But a thick fog had rolled in, cutting visibility to less than a kilometer. For safety, Maritime Control issued an alert, halting all nighttime departures. 10 ships, including theirs, were grounded. As the students waited, chatting and staring out at the misty sea, hours ticked by. By 8:30 p.m., the fog began to lift. But the captain of the Ohamina, perhaps being extra cautious, showed no signs of preparing to depart. A murmur of anxiety spread through the students. Among the ships scheduled to leave that night was another ferry, the MV Sewol. It was a sister ship to the Ohamina, owned by the same company. The Sewol was loaded with cargo and was in a hurry to get to Jeju. It was the first to request permission to leave as soon as the fog cleared, and Maritime Control gave the green light. The Sewol became the only ferry to get clearance to sail that night. The ship already had over 100 passengers, but there were plenty of empty cabins, more than enough for the students and teachers of Danwon High. To save the trip, the school made a last-minute decision. After a quick consultation with the captain, they would switch ships and sail on the MV Sewol. A cheer erupted from the students. They quickly called and texted their parents with the news. Soon, more than 300 teenagers were dragging their colorful suitcases up the gangway of the MV Sewol, their excitement renewed. For most, it was their first time on such a large ship. They explored with wide-eyed curiosity, laughing and joking as they were guided to the 4th deck, which had been set aside just for them. The cabins were simple, like dorm rooms with bunk beds for 8 people. The students quickly settled in, some sprawling on their bunks, others peering out the portholes at the dark water below. At 9 p.m., with a blast of its horn, the MV Sewol slowly pulled away from the dock. The students on deck cheered as the coastline receded. For them, after the intense pressure of the South Korean education system, this trip was a precious chance to unwind. Some stayed on deck, feeling the sea breeze, while others took photos, ate snacks in their cabins, or told ghost stories in the dark. At 10 p.m., a spectacular fireworks show lit up the night sky, each burst of color reflecting in the students' joyful eyes. The next day happened to be one of their teachers' birthdays, so a group of them stayed up late. Just after midnight, they surprised him with a cake, singing and taking photos to capture the happy memory. Slowly, as the ship sailed on through the darkness, the passengers and students drifted off to sleep. The next morning, around 8:30 a.m., students began waking up and heading to the third-deck cafeteria for breakfast. The ship was now sailing through the Mengol Channel, a stretch of water known for its strong underwater currents. But the sea was calm, and the journey was almost over. In 2 hours, they would be in Jeju. Then, at 8:48 a.m., it happened. A violent lurch shook the entire vessel. On the cargo deck, massive shipping containers snapped their restraints and crashed into the sea with thunderous booms. But worse, the ship didn't right itself. It began to list, tilting sharply to its left side, settling at a terrifying 30-degree angle. In the third-deck cafeteria, passengers and furniture slid across the floor like dominoes. People were thrown from their feet, unable to stand. The hallways were a chaotic scene of fallen passengers, many of them injured. In a fourth-deck corridor, a sophomore named Choi Diakha was thrown to the ground. Realizing something was terribly wrong, he did something remarkable. For minutes after the incident began, at 8:52 a.m., he pulled out his phone and dialed 119, South Korea's emergency number.
상황실입니다. 네, 살려주세요. 여보세요. 여보세요. 예. 119.
Choi was known for being a calm kid, but his voice trembled as he tried to explain the situation, fighting to control his fear. He was the first person on the MV Sewol to call for help, even before the crew.
배가 침몰된 것 같아요. 배가 침몰해요? 네, 여기 제주도 가고 있었는데. 예. 여기 지금 배가 배경에서 떨어진 것 같아요, 지금. 잠깐만요. 자, 지금 타고 계신 배가 침몰한다는 소리예요? 아니면 옆에 있는 다른 배가 침몰한다는 소리예요? 배가요.
The call was eventually transferred to the Mokpo Coast Guard. The operator, assuming Choi was a crew member, started asking for the ship's latitude and longitude. Confused, Choi did his best to describe what was happening, telling them there were over 300 students on board and they needed help. Just as he was on the phone, the ship's intercom crackled to life. A calm, female voice made an announcement. Please remain in your current location and do not move. That single sentence would be repeated over and over for the next hour. At 8:55 a.m., 3 minutes after the student's call, the Sewol's first mate, Kang Won-jik, finally sent a distress signal to the Jeju Vessel Traffic Service Center. It took another few minutes for the message to be relayed to the Mokpo Coast Guard, who, thanks to a high school student, had already dispatched a patrol boat. Inside the ship, the students were terrified, but the announcement to stay put offered a strange sense of order amidst the chaos. Teachers calmed them down, and everyone obediently sat where they were, trusting that the crew had the situation under control. To break the tense silence, some students started making jokes, trying to keep their spirits up as they waited. But the ship kept tilting. By 9:13 a.m., 25 minutes into the crisis, the list was over 50 degrees. It was becoming impossible to stand. Still, no rescue had arrived. And still, the intercom repeated the same chilling message. Stay where you are. Do not move. The students, with the help of their teachers, started putting on life jackets. They could no longer walk down the hallways. They had to slide along the walls, which were quickly becoming the floor. Fear was setting in. Half an hour after the lurch at 9:18 a.m., a student looking out a porthole saw a red ship approaching. A wave of relief swept through them. It was the MV Dula Ace, the closest vessel, which had raced to the scene after hearing the distress call. But as it got closer, its captain saw a bizarre and disturbing sight. The Sewol was clearly in catastrophic trouble, surrounded by floating cargo containers, but its decks were completely empty. There was no one there. The crew of the Sewol was not evacuating anyone. The Jindo Vessel Traffic Service Center was now in constant contact, pleading with the Sewol's crew to get people off the ship. First Mate Kang Won-jik gave excuses. He claimed the broadcast system was broken. He said there were too many passengers, and he worried they wouldn't be rescued if they abandoned ship. Even after Jindo VTS gave repeated assurances that help was there, The crew did nothing. Instead, they continued to tell passengers to stay inside. At 9:32 a.m., more civilian boats, mostly fishing vessels, began arriving. The Coast Guard Patrol Boat 123 and a helicopter were also on scene. But there was no coordination. No one seemed to be in charge. No one tried to enter the ship. They just circled, watching as the massive ferry slowly died. Inside, the students were trapped. The water had not yet breached the passenger decks. With so many boats waiting outside, an orderly evacuation would have saved them. But the order never came. Then, in an instant, everything changed. Seawater burst through the third deck, flooding the corridors and cabins. The ship's list increased to 62 degrees. The hallways filled with screams. 2 teachers were swept away by the torrent. The students' composure shattered. Some began to cry out for their parents. On shore, parents who had received texts from their children rushed to the coast, praying for a miracle. But on the ship, the only sound from the authorities was the same recorded message, playing over the roar of the incoming water. Stay where you are. Some passengers realized they couldn't wait any longer. They began a desperate scramble to escape. The top deck was now almost level with the sea. At 9:37 a.m., Captain Lee Jun-suk made his final report to Jindo VTS. Then, all communication from the Sewol went silent. A small Coast Guard rubber boat finally managed to approach the ship. At 9:48 a.m., they pulled their first group of survivors from the deck. They weren't students. They weren't teachers. They were 8 crew members, including Captain Lee Jun-suk himself, who was rescued wearing only a sweater and his underwear. While the crew saved themselves, the students remained below, following instructions. A few disobedient ones, with the help of a brave passenger, used a fire hose to climb up the tilted corridors to the deck, where they were eventually airlifted to safety. At 10:03 a.m., the ship's list passed 70 degrees. In the third-floor main hall, dozens of people were trapped. The floor was now a near-vertical wall. Their only escape was to climb a 20-meter fire hose to an exit. Some made it. Others, exhausted, lost their grip and fell as the sea poured in, swallowing the hall and everyone left inside. At 10:04 a.m., a fisheries patrol vessel, captained by a man named Park Sung-ji, arrived on the scene. He was stunned. The Sewol was on its side, surrounded by over 20 boats that were doing nothing. Without hesitating, Park steered his vessel directly toward the sinking ship. He saw a group of passengers trapped on the stern. He and his crew climbed onto the tilting deck and personally saved 28 people. Seeing his official boat take action, the civilian fishing boats finally moved in. In the next 15 minutes, those fishermen, ordinary citizens, rescued 120 people. They became the heroes the official rescuers were not. By 10:15 a.m., the Sewol had tilted past 90 degrees. It was about to capsize. The last few passengers on deck made a terrifying choice. They jumped into the frigid ocean. 2 minutes later, at 10:17 a.m., the MV Sewol rolled over completely. Inside, the remaining students finally understood they had been betrayed. Water flooded the fourth deck. A group of 40 students near an exit were swept out by the current and miraculously rescued by the boats nearby. But for the rest, it was too late. The water pressure sealed their cabin doors shut. Their last escape route was gone. In the darkness, surrounded by the sound of rushing water, they banged on the windows. They sent final, heartbreaking messages to their parents. One read, "The ship is tilting. Mom, Dad, I want to see you." It was the last message that parent ever received. The sinking ship created a powerful vortex, and at 10:18 a.m., the Navy ordered all boats to pull back. As Fisheries Officer Park Sung-ji was about to leave, he heard a cry for help. It was a student in a life jacket, struggling in the water, dangerously close to being sucked down with the ship. Park raced his boat back, pulling the boy from the water. That student, Park Jun-hyuk, was the last person to be rescued alive. He had been inside with a female classmate when the ship flipped. They held hands and swam through the inverted, flooded corridors, completely disoriented. They took a final breath and dove, hoping to find a way out. The current tore them apart. He made it to the surface. She was never seen again. By 11:18 a.m., the MV Sewol had almost completely vanished, with only its blue, bulbous bow visible above the waves. The official response that followed was a masterclass in incompetence and deceit. President Park Geun-hye was notified of the disaster, but then disappeared for 7 hours. At 11:01 a.m., with hundreds still trapped, the Central Disaster Headquarters reported to the president's office that there were no casualties. The media ran with the story. All 476 passengers and crew of the Sewol Ferry have been rescued. For 49 agonizing minutes, the nation and the parents believed it. But when they couldn't reach their children, the horrible truth began to dawn. The government later admitted they had no idea what was happening on the ship. The rescue effort was a chaotic mess. The Navy salvage unit arrived without diving equipment. The Coast Guard's deep-sea rescue team was hours late. When President Park Geun-hye finally appeared that evening, she seemed utterly unaware of the situation, asking a now infamous question. "I heard the students were all wearing life jackets. Is it that difficult to find them?" The government lied about the scale of the rescue, claiming hundreds of divers were at work when parents at the scene saw no one in the water. For days, civilian divers were blocked by the Coast Guard from helping. The captain and crew who had abandoned their passengers offered no help to rescuers. The search for survivors became a search for bodies. It continued until November 11th, 209 days after the sinking. Of the 476 people on board the MV Sewol, only 172 were rescued. 304 people died or were missing, presumed dead. Among them was Choi Deok-ha, the brave student who made the first call for help. 3 years later, in 2017, the wreck of the MV Sewol was finally raised from the seabed. The investigation confirmed what many already suspected. The ship was a death trap. It was dangerously overloaded, carrying more than double its legal cargo limit. To compensate, the crew had drained most of the ship's ballast water, which is crucial for stability. The illegal modifications had made the ship top-heavy and prone to capsizing. On that day, a sharp, possibly uncontrolled turn caused the unsecured cargo to shift, and the ship, without enough ballast to right itself, simply fell over. But the sinking was only half the story. The real cause of the catastrophic death toll was human. The captain and crew told their passengers to stay put while they saved themselves. The Coast Guard failed to act and even obstructed civilian rescue efforts. The government was disorganized, dishonest, and completely inept. In the face of such inexplicable failure, dark theories began to circulate. The most prominent involved a cult-like church and President Park Geun-hye herself. The president was known to be deeply influenced by Choi Soon-sil, the daughter of a charismatic cult leader named Choi Tae-min. He had died in 1994, exactly 20 years before the disaster, and had allegedly prophesied his own rebirth. The Sewol sank just days before the anniversary of his death. The unthinkable theory was that the 304 victims were a human sacrifice, orchestrated by the president for a dark ritual. The president's missing 7 hours, they whispered, were spent in prayer. Adding fuel to the fire, the Sewol's owner, Yoo Byung-eun, was a leader in another fringe religious group with a dark past. The ship's original captain had been fired after repeatedly warning about the vessel's stability issues. The replacement, Captain Lee Jun-suk, was a temporary hire. 2 months after the disaster, Yoo Byung-eun was found dead in a field, his body so decomposed that a cause of death could not be determined. In the end, justice was partial. Captain Lee Jun-suk was convicted of murder for his inaction and sentenced to life in prison. 15 other crew members received sentences ranging from 18 months to 12 years. It's important to note that 3 crew members were hailed as heroes. They stayed behind, helping passengers until the very end, and died with them. In total, 53 officials from the company and the Coast Guard were convicted of various crimes. For the surviving students of Danwon High School, the trauma was unimaginable. They eventually returned to a school haunted by empty desks. In January 2016, the school held a special graduation ceremony. The desks of the deceased were covered in flowers and photos. Later, the survivors fulfilled a promise. They took the photos of their lost friends and traveled to Jeju Island. On that beautiful island, under a clear, sunny sky, they took pictures with their departed classmates, finally finishing the school trip that had ended in tragedy.